Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Once the American woman never got closer to war than the letter she wrote to her soldier. Today, there are 360,000 women in the armed forces. 220,000 women have served in Iraq and Afghanistan alone. They and the more than 2 million women veterans need unique support and unique services. The Service Women's Action Network, called SWAN, established in 2007, has become a pioneering human rights organization providing advocacy and services to all service women and women veterans. Anuradha Bhagwati, the executive director, is my guest. Welcome.
Thank you.
And you are a former Marine captain in the Marine Corps.
That's right.
I want to find out how you got into the Marine Corps, but let's talk a little bit more about the problems that we face with and that we need to all understand so women who serve in the armed services really get the kind of services and treatment they're used to.
Sure. Well, the armed forces looks very different today than it did 10, 20 years ago. Women are absolutely serving in combat. It's something that, the average person on the streets doesn't necessarily know, that women not only carry weapons,
Right.
but they're using them in combat. Women are suffering the same wounds of war as their male counterparts. They're coming back from war with PTSD, with traumatic brain injury, with depression, and with debilitating mental health and physical conditions. But because the bureaucracy in the VA is still extremely traditional and conservative, and the VA is used to serving male veterans, obviously, because men have traditionally served in the armed forces, it's taking quite a bit of time for services for returning women veterans to
work up.
Exactly.
Now, within the veterans, the whole area of benefits and assistance and help to veterans, you've got the hospital system where the service people who are really wounded and can't go back to duty find themselves, right? Then once they're discharged from that, they go into a separate service. Is that right?
Not exactly. So you have the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, which consists of two separate branches. So you've got the hospital or the medical center side of things, where veterans who have been discharged, most veterans have access, and there are different priority groups. So there's no guarantee that just because you've served in the armed forces that you have access to VA health care. It's a bit of a myth. There's an application process. There's a prioritization of whether or not you should be eligible. If you make it through, yes, you're eligible for VA health care. But then there's the benefit side, and these systems are completely separate. So if you've been diagnosed with a medical condition or with a mental health condition such as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's a common condition from trauma in combat, from the trauma of being sexually assaulted or sexually harassed. It can be from a variety of life-threatening situations. If you've been diagnosed with PTSD by a VA psychiatrist or counselor or psychologist
in a hospital
at a VA, this is a government VA government hospital, doesn't necessarily mean that the benefit side of the system will award you compensation for your PTSD. And that separateness, the disparity between the two systems is largely responsible for veterans not being given benefits.
And when we talk about that, it's equivalent to a disability pay.
Absolutely. It's a monthly check.
Because people are not able to work.
Exactly. They're not able to work, or they're not able to get around.
But can they get services? How do they go to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist?
So that's an eligibility issue.
If they're not in the hospital.
Right. So there are a number of services available to veterans. The VA hospital is sort of the traditionally known system.
Right. And that's on an outpatient basis.
And inpatient. Absolutely. There are also vet centers, which were established after the Vietnam War when Vietnam veterans were coming back and were not getting adequate services at these VA medical centers, at the hospital. So vet centers were established. They're like local community centers for veterans. They're funded by the VA, but they're not in the hospitals. They're very communal. They're oftentimes a much more intimate place to talk to counselors. If you're a combat veteran, you're eligible. If you've been sexually traumatized, you're eligible, and so on. There are a few eligibility requirements, but it's much more broad than the VA hospital system.
And do you have to get that as a benefit?
No.
You just can go.
You just have to prove that through your DD-214, which is your military discharge paperwork, that you served and that you're eligible. And there are counselors there. They're oftentimes run by veterans themselves, so senior veterans who themselves our counselors, and it's a much more comfortable setting, especially for veterans who've been traumatized and aren't comfortable using a very institutional system like the VA hospital.
Are they overcrowded? Do they have waiting lists? Are they open to everybody? Are they adequate in number?
The VA hospitals are definitely booked to the full, and depending on where you are in the nation, in New York we have several VA hospitals, but in the Midwest, depending on what state you're in, not so. You might have to travel several hours to get to a VA hospital. For women, because there are so fewer services that are targeted for women, and we're not just talking about the world of OBGYN. I mean, traditionally, that's what women's health amounted to, but we're talking about mental health professionals who specialize in gender-specific services, as well as physicians. So, if you're a woman who's been sexually assaulted, or you're a woman who just returned from combat and you experienced some sort of traumatic event, chances are your healing will be better in a setting which is conducive to talking comfortably with perhaps a female physician or female therapist. And depending, there are lots of issues with gender that need to be taken into account when forming these, when each VA hospital forms its services for women veterans. So sometimes women veterans may be more comfortable talking in a group of women, but sometimes not. If she's a combat veteran, she might be more comfortable talking in a mixed gender group. It really depends on the woman. But right now, there are so few gender-specific services. So, in terms of women's groups, in terms of PTSD groups for women, and again, PTSD is a condition that can result from any traumatic, life-threatening event. So not necessarily combat.
And then many of these women come home to children too.
Absolutely. And so there thousands and thousands of single mothers have deployed, but also mothers who are partners or spouses, sometimes of male veterans. You have many families that have deployed either together or they've alternated. First dad goes over, then mom goes over. And so you've got this issue of family care plans and who's taking care of the kids. And so things have...
Are most of these women from National Guards and state organizations, or are they enlisted people?
They're active duty as well as reserve and National Guard. So what we're seeing in these two wars is that our National Guard units are being deployed like they never have been in the history of the U.S. Armed Forces.
And people, I mean, that's the other thing, is a lot of people think that people enlist in the armed forces for the educational benefits they can get, for the extra money they can get, so that if you're in the Guard, is that what you call it? What do you call it? You're there to supplement income sometimes.
Absolutely.
Not with the expectation necessarily that you're going to war.
Right, for National Guard units and reserve units, and you've got service members whose full-time jobs are in the community. They're teachers, they're physicians, they're janitors, they're people just like you and me. But when they're called to duty, they put on the uniform, and in this case, they oftentimes deploy straight to Afghanistan or Iraq.
Now, there was a bill, wasn't it, a law last year for women that covered some women's benefits in the Congress?
Right. Senator Patty Murray from Washington sponsored a health care bill which addresses some of these disparities in the hospital system.
The hospital system.
Absolutely. So benefits, again, is a whole different beast.
And then there's another federal, I don't know if it's a restriction, but which says that women should not be in actual combat.
Right. So there's a congressional ban on women in direct ground combat, and it's in units lower than the brigade level. It basically, the intent behind the policy is to prevent women from being fired upon or firing upon the so-called enemy. So right now, we're seeing that policy is completely obsolete. I mean, commanders in the Army and the Marine Corps will openly tell you that they're actually deploying women in dangerous live fire situations. So women and non-combat personnel, and by combat I mean there are in both the Army and the Marine Corps and Special Forces, there are specific units that are trained to be on the so-called front lines. But in these wars, we don't have front lines. So things like the infantry, artillery, special forces, and so on, armored vehicles, which are by law open only to men, are being supplemented with service support personnel, who are both male and female, but also female units, which are specifically designed as liaison units to accompany, say, the infantry into villages in Afghanistan and Iraq, and to liaise with the local women in homes.
Very. And so they're right there. They're with the IED. I mean, anything can go off any place and they can get shot.
Absolutely.
And we see it if you look at the people who've been killed There's a good number of women there.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And also, aside from the infantry units and the all-male units, you do have mixed gender units going out on convoys, and the weapon of these wars is the improvised explosive device.
Yeah.
And it's affecting all personnel. And
Doesn't it really shock you at how little people on their ordinary days think about this?
it doesn't surprise me that much. I mean, it's, the American people haven't been asked to sacrifice. I mean, 99% of Americans have not served in the military. And we have a different system today. It's an all-volunteer military. But that 1% is really sacrificing.
Absolutely. And every day you get the casualty list, but it's a little thing, at least in the New York Times. And I always want to read it just to... I feel it's my contribution. I'm paying respect to these poor people. For years they talked about what women should do in the armed forces, and it was always. It reminded me of putting policewomen in cars with policemen, and the debate. The wives of the policemen didn't want the women, the whole thing. So there are women in police cars now with men, and there are women in the military with men. But I don't think the argument against it was ever to protect the women. It was basically for the men. It would be a distraction to the men. And it seems to me that a disproportionate number, well, it is disproportionate, one of the biggest problems women in the military have is sexual harassment and rape. Is that true?
It's true, especially sexual harassment, which is a daily feature of being a woman in the military.
Yeah.
I mean, and a lot of women in the process of being trained and indoctrinated into their respective branch of service, I think don't realize the extent to which they're numbing themselves to the daily exposure. I mean, if you ask a lot of servicewomen who are still wearing the uniform, they'll deny the level of harassment which exists, and it's sort of a common reaction, I think, to being subjected to it. It's a survival tactic, basically, because if the things that are allowed to be said in the military on a daily basis would not be allowed to be said in the civilian workforce, and it's quite shocking. The things that I can't say here, for instance.
I see.
And in terms of assault and rape, absolutely, it's happening at an epidemic rate in the military. It's the dirty little secret in the U.S. Armed Forces. It's very difficult to talk about a situation which is perpetuated by service members themselves. The system right now is completely broken to deal with sexual assault.
There is no system, is there?
Well, there is a system. It's a bit of a puppet system.
Yeah,
there's actually an agency in charge of sexual assault, which does very little. It's focused on collecting data to provide statistics for annual reports.
And they can't even really collect the data because the whole force itself, I mean, the whole esprit de corps is against it, isn't it? I mean, aren't you supposed to be a family and loyal to your colleagues?
Absolutely. I mean,
and then you have a man hitting on a woman.
It's very similar to incest.
Yeah.
And it's an appropriate analogy because you've got this family that you've been trained to believe will take care of you in life and death circumstances. And when your brother in arms is the one assaulting you or harassing you, it's a huge violation. It's a betrayal. And then your
that's
trust
the first step.
Absolutely.
Right. Then the next step is,
do you tell anybody? Do you tell anybody? Do you tell even your friends, your coworkers?
Right.
Because your harassment can start then when your female or male peers decide to harass you, taunt you, question why you're ruining a good man's career, or why you want so much attention, or you're making it up. I mean, some themes are common to the civilian workforce, but others are not. You can't just quit your job.
Right.
You'll be thrown in jail. You can't just transfer out of your unit. You'll be punished. So the more you speak up, the harder your life becomes. If you do decide to formally report, things can become even more threatening. So if the perpetrator's in your chain of command, obviously, there's going to be, your life will be endangered, right? So there are some mechanisms by which you can report outside the chain of command that exist today, but still, you will stick out. There's no anonymity. The notion that there's privacy in the military or that junior enlisted service members have any authority or power is completely ludicrous. And the majority of sexual assault survivors are junior enlisted. So they're 18, 19, 20 years old oftentimes with no rank whatsoever. If you have no rank in the military, you have no power. And things can get very ugly, especially if you're accusing a senior person.
And then when you do accuse somebody and it does work up, what happens then?
your commander, the beauty of the system right now in the military is that your commander is the one who will decide what happens to an alleged perpetrator, regardless of evidence or recommendations. So ultimately, you have a legal system in the military which is designed to provide recommendations to the commander, whether to go forth with a court-martial, which is the military's solution to these crimes. But the commander at any point along the way can decide not to. Ultimately, it's his or her choice. And when you're talking about a perpetrator and a victim or survivor in the same unit, ultimately a commander's best interest is keeping his family intact, because he needs service. He needs his unit whole in order to fulfill his mission. So it's very difficult. There's no incentive for the commander. As it is today, as the system is today, there's no incentive for the commander to actually do the right thing, and the commander's punished if there are X number of crimes basically perpetuated in his or her unit. What incentive does he or her have to? Absolutely.
But then if they do keep a record, they don't even keep it forever, do they? They keep it for 2 years or
for equal opportunity investigation. So if you're sexually harassed, or if you're the victim of racial discrimination or any other form of discrimination, and you choose to file an formal investigation, which again is a very courageous thing to do, that investigation, which is conducted by an independent investigator, comes into the unit, interviews witnesses, interviews the victim or the accuser, as well as the alleged perpetrator. That investigation is kept on the records for 2 years and then destroyed. There's no record of it after 2 years. So if you've been, again, the victim of debilitating harassment, I think we really downplay the effects of sexual harassment and racial discrimination and so on in our society. When you get out as a veteran, and you need the evidence to prove that your PTSD is based on an actual incident in the military, that evidence won't be there. So it's quite shocking, and it's something very few people know about. And service members who even initiate these investigations, the targets of this harassment or discrimination, aren't even briefed about it by equal employment opportunity officers. So it's another one of these secrets. It's written in policy, but nobody knows about it until you need the paperwork several years later.
Another major issue for you, there are two, I think, that you're really concentrating on: homelessness.
We are focusing on homelessness. I mean, the more women serve in the military, and the more they're subjected to trauma, whether that's from combat or from just serving as a woman in the military, whether it's being subject to discrimination or harassment, the more layers of trauma exist in her life. And when she gets out and she's already dealing with the difficulties of transitioning from one extremely insular culture to the civilian world, which again so few people serve, that it's very difficult to make that transition. The harder it is to find employment, to feel good about yourself,
to find your own benefits,
right? To find your benefits, exactly. It's quite a challenge.
And then you've been active with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy.
Yes, it's been in the news quite a bit recently. Don't Ask, Don't Tell is a policy which most people, I think, even people who would not like to see gays and lesbians serve openly in the military, most people know about it. It's
a big thing.
It's a big thing. What people don't often know is that it disproportionately targets women and people of color in the military. So women make up about 15% of the military today throughout the branches, but they make up 34% of the discharges, over a third, which is shocking. And in the Air Force last year, they made up over 60% of the discharges, which is, again, unbelievable. It's not because more lesbians are serving in the military. It's because women stick out like a sore thumb. And depending on the branch, I mean, in the Marine Corps, for instance, only 6% of Marines are female. So you are, the attention is always on you. The scrutiny is always on you, whether or not you're performing well or poorly. But it's a pressure cooker. Every woman in the military knows that. And if anything sticks out, and if somebody has a grudge against you, especially, more eyes will be on you. So lesbian baiting is a common feature of military service for women, for straight women and for gay women. If you rebuke the advances, sexual advances of a peer, and he can label you a lesbian, and of course all of this is that culture. That culture exists, regardless of whether or not you reject somebody's sexual advances. People are always gossiping about women in the military, but that's enough to initiate an investigation under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So it's not that there aren't gay men in the military. Of course there are gay men in the military, but they blend in a little more because there are more men in the military. As far as people of color are concerned, they make up almost 30% of the total armed forces, but make up 45% of Don't Ask, Don't Tell discharges, which is appalling, almost half.
Unbelievable.
So race also plays a factor. And again, any so-called minority in the military is going to stick out because there are fewer people of color and fewer women.
The military is predominantly white still?
Predominantly, yeah. I mean, people of color disproportionately serve, but even then are disproportionately discharged under this policy.
It's amazing. So now also you're reaching out to veterans, women veterans who didn't know they had these rights or who come out and know the problems. I mean, explain to them, what's the spirit of a former member of the armed forces who's a woman?
Sure. I mean, women are dealing with a lot of issues that are common to male veterans, but again, there are some that are very specific to being a woman in the military, and it often involves gender discrimination, sexual harassment, or sexual assault. But there's sexism even in the sort of the experience of a woman who doesn't think she's been traumatized, but comes out of the military, maybe having served in Iraq or Afghanistan, where isolation is a common feature of being a woman in the military, not quite feeling accepted all of the time. At the very least, that's a common feature of being a woman in the military. And you're less likely to be accepted by the veterans culture, which is still very male-dominated. Most of the mainstream veteran service organizations are led by, I would say almost all of them, by men, by former male officers who cannot identify with being a woman in uniform, whether they served yesterday or 30 years ago or 50 years ago. Many of the organizations go back, as far as World War II. So
when you get out of the armed force, do you have lifetime health insurance?
No, there's no guarantee. So again, when you're discharged, you have your paperwork, but depending on your experience in the military, you may not be eligible for VA health care. So for instance, let's say you're a National Guardsman. You've been promised health care in the future by your recruiter. It's common promise by a recruiter. But you serve for several years, but your unit never deploys overseas, but you're diligently performing your duties. You're a great NCO, you've been promoted. You get out after several years, you won't be guaranteed health care. If you're injured or wounded while in service, there's no automatic care. You have to apply for those benefits. You have to be awarded compensation by that benefits half of the Veterans Administration.
And the benefits half acts like an insurance company. It can reject some of your claims or not?
It can reject the claim if they believe there's insufficient evidence, but it's beyond, the system is so broken that right now there are several VA regional offices which process these claims and paper pushing offices basically, who, right here in New York, our regional office on Houston Street, which processes all these New York area veterans claims, was found out to have shredded hundreds and hundreds of documents over the course of months. And so there's very little faith that veterans have in the Benefits Administration right now. So you could have had, a file this thick outlining all of your injuries, your wounds from battle, from sexual assault, from being traumatized, and all the evidence, all the medical history to back it up, and it could be shredded.
That's so outrageous. So it's very important to have really vocal, articulate advocates. This should be a major issue in the health insurance coverage, right?
It could be. The problem right now is that the VA needs to fix itself. Veterans are more likely to get help from the VA, and yet they're so underutilizing the VA health services.
Are there women in top command in the Veterans Affairs Department, in the agency?
There are. Okay. But again, it's an age-old bureaucracy. So change, even though right now the VA is headed up by some wonderful people, that change will trickle down slower. So it's a combination of change in the VA, the desire in Congress, and the exposure in the media, education of the public.
We're almost at the end of this program. First of all, there is a website that people can go to. Right. And what is it?
It's www.servicewomen.org.
Okay,
so it's SERVICEWOMEN.
Now, how did you come about to become a Marine?
I was a little older than most folks in the sense that I was 24. I was out of college, and I was searching for what I wanted to do in life. I was having issues with my family, so I rebelled. I did the most kind of extreme thing that I could do, and the Marine Corps was the most extreme branch given my options
right.
in the armed forces. And so, yeah, I took a plunge and signed up.
And then, and it was 4 years that you served?
It was 5 years.
5 years that you served, and you were a captain.
Right, so I went
did
the
you go to
officer
officers?
route.
Yeah. And then you went back to school.
I went back to school, and was shocked in how difficult that transition was.
Yeah. Where did you go to college?
I went to Yale.
Were you the only woman Yale graduate to ever become a Marine?
No, I don't think so. Maybe,
perhaps. What did they say when you did that?
Oftentimes they thought I was a spy.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went back to graduate school?
I went back to graduate school in public policy.
And now that's what you have a master's degree in that? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which
So now you're seeing from the advocacy point of view of how you can affect public policy.
Absolutely.
And
a lot can be done.
Right. So do you have other groups that you work closely with?
Absolutely.
Are they women's organizations or are they military organizations?
Both. And that's, I think, one of the beauties of like the modern day veterans movement is that we realize that in order to get things done, because so few people are serving in the military right now, is we have to engage the public. We have to engage nonprofits. And for us, because we're a human rights organization, we're dealing with all of the disparities in treatment of women across the board, whether it's reproductive rights, equality in the workplace in terms of job opportunities, sexual harassment, you name it. There are experts in the field, obviously, in the civilian workplace. So we work with gender-based violence organizations. We work with women's rights advocacy organizations. We also work with the mainstream veterans organizations, and anyone who is willing to acknowledge that women are faced with particular circumstances.
So you're looking for connections, but you're also looking for money.
Oh, absolutely. We are on a shoestring budget. We do so much on adrenaline and desire, but we are not well funded because very few people know about us still.
Well, hopefully they're going to begin to hear from you a lot.
I hope
and
so.
that you will be well funded. Thanks so much, Anu.
Thank you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.